Hey guys, before we get started on this episode, I've just read 15-20 minutes ago about the passing of Mitchell Wiggins, former NBA player and, of course, father of current Warrior forward Andrew. Super tough time for Andrew, and I really hope that he and his family are going okay. I'd like to think I know a little bit about what he's going through. It's a weird time given I buried my old man's ashes just over 12 hours ago, so pretty tough time. But we all have our own personal stories, personal emotions, and I think this whole situation should prove a reminder to a lot of people that we don't know what other people are going through. And Andrew's had so much stuff said about him, uh, himself scrutinised pretty fiercely over the past couple of seasons, and that includes from me, right? And I, do this for a living. I probably don't have the right to sometimes, but I do scrutinise athletes and NBA players, and I'm happy to talk positively and negatively about them. But what I'll try and never do is talk about them from an individual perspective in terms of their off-court stuff, particularly in a way like this where Andrew Wiggins has taken leave over the past couple of seasons, and I think people have very wrongly jumped on rumours or just made their own assumptions as to why that's been the case. And I think this news today has proved a reminder to a lot of people of how silly they were, how wrong they were. And I would never criticise someone who, whether it's an athlete, an NBA player, any sport, any work environment anywhere in the world, if you've got legitimate issues personally that you need to sort out, you need to take the time, because that is more important than your work. And for NBA players, oftentimes, work is their life, and it's so much more difficult because, someone like Andrew is scrutinized on a day-by-day basis. But I think this should prove a reminder to everyone that we do not know what Andrew's been going through. And I think this may help a little bit in actually understanding, what he's been going through and why his form last season wasn't necessarily at the level that we may have expected it to be. Because I know, having lost my old man over 12 months ago, you have your good days and you have your bad days. And that's probably how you could reflect on Wiggs' form last season. I don't think that's any surprise. And I don't want to bring this back to too much of an NBA discussion, because it's a very personal family matter that's so much bigger than basketball. But I think I really resonate with the struggles that he would have had over last season with his father's health issues, that by the sound of it have been going on for a while. And I just think it's a reminder to us to not jump necessarily, as I said, at rumours or making our own assumptions on what's going on when we have no idea about what's going on. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Andrew, and I'm sure the Warriors are getting around him very much at the moment and trying to provide as much support as they can. And hope we get to see him back on the court next season. But right now, that's not the priority, and thinking of him and his family at this time. This episode, guys, just wanted to talk about a couple of things that have come out on the Warriors over the past 24, 48 hours or so. Perhaps the biggest one yesterday was, I guess, the first time the Warriors have been confirmed to have interest in Miami Heat star Jimmy Butler. Butler's a name that has been linked to the Warriors previously, back in May, by the Athletic's Anthony Slater. But Sam Amick, also of the Athletic, jumped on the TK show with Tim Kawakami and seemed to say that the Warriors do have interest there. This is what he said. He said, talking trade-wise, a couple of guys who come to mind. Jimmy Butler is going to be a free agent next summer. Didn't get an extension done. The Warriors, as you know, have interest there, and I think probably made a couple of calls during the summer. So that last line is really interesting. Interest, and that may have extended to making a couple of calls during the summer to see about the trade availability of Jimmy Butler. Obviously, nothing has been forthcoming at this point, but that doesn't mean that could change. So Jimmy is entering the final year of his deal, $48.8 million, which is quite a lot. And it's probably difficult for the Warriors to get to that mark until the guys they sign in the offseason become trade eligible. You're talking about D'Anthony Melton on $12.5 million or $12.8 million. Kyle Anderson is on about $9 million, Buddy Hield $8.5 million, whatever it is. Those kind of mid-tier salaries. It's probably hard for the Warriors to get to Jimmy Butler because they don't really have a lot of big contracts right now outside of Steph and Draymond and Wiggs, I suppose, as well. Then Jimmy has a player option for the 2025-26 season at $52.4 million. That's also a lot, and it's going to surprise, it's going to interest me whether he takes that on or not, because by the sounds of it, he wants an extension and he could, opt out and get, more guaranteed years, I suppose, if he does get to next offseason without a deal. It's really just going to come down to how he plays next season, because I actually think he's got to a point where if he declines anymore, then it might be difficult for him to get a max extension, and therefore do you just opt into that $52.4 million? It's just really going to depend on how he plays next season. He's going to be super motivated. He's always super motivated, as it is anyway. But he's always kind of got a chip on his shoulder, and I think if Miami don't give him extension here before the start of the season, then I think that's just going to add to that chip on the shoulder, and he's going to come out and want to play at a really, really high level next season. In terms of his fit with the Warriors, well, again, I've thought about this for a few months now, going back to the late May, where Slater kind of proposed it, but didn't say the Warriors, didn't out and out say the Warriors were interested. It was more just a hypothetical. Here's a guy that could become available given the contract situation, given there was sounded like a little bit of animosity between him and the Miami Heat after their season ended in the first round against the Celtics. Of course, Jimmy had a little bit to say from the bench during that first round series. And then, of course, Pat Riley publicly in the media kind of criticized Jimmy for talking while he was injured on the bench. He missed the entire first round, 5-game first round series that the Heat lost there to the Celtics. So that's another thing with Jimmy, is that the injuries are a concern. He hasn't played more than 65 games since 2016-17 or something like that. So obviously the salary makes it difficult, and if you've got to commit a max extension to kind of get him to stay around, that also makes it very difficult. Do you want to be paying Jimmy Butler over $50 million a season in 4 or 5 years' time? Probably not. And we had this same conversation with Paul George, who obviously the Warriors sounds like they were willing to give a 4-year, $220 million max extension to, which would have been paying him over $50 million a year at age 38, 39. I think I'd have a little bit more difficulty with Jimmy because PG was a better fit. If you look at the guys the Warriors have targeted in terms of, clearly PG and Markkanen, much better shooters than what Jimmy is, and as a result, just cleaner fits, I think, for the Warriors. Jimmy, a little bit more clunky in an offense, you put him in at small forward, you put him next to Kuminga and Draymond. Is there enough shooting there? Well, Jimmy did shoot a career high 41.4% from three-point range last season, but it's less than 2.5 attempts per game. I was actually really interested last season watching him. There were times where he didn't seem overly motivated. And what I mean by that, he averaged, I think it was 13 field goal attempts per game last season. And a couple of times I was watching him, the aggressiveness that we've kind of come to see from Jimmy Butler just wasn't necessarily there. And that was the second lowest average field goal attempts of his career over the last 10 seasons. Right. And so there just wasn't necessarily the aggression and maybe deferring to teammates a little bit more, which is, unlike Jimmy necessarily. He's an alpha dog. And that doesn't necessarily, actually, from a Warrior perspective, that doesn't concern me too much, because he would come, if he were to come to the Warriors, he wouldn't be the alpha dog anymore. He'd be the second behind Steph, and therefore, if he's averaging 20 points a game, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, really good efficiency like he was last season, 49.9% from the floor, 41.4% from three. If he's doing that, then that's good for the Warriors, I think. And so I don't think he's a perfect fit by any means, just because of this, the contractual situation and his fit as a player with the lack of shooting, at least compared to someone like George or Markkanen. There are some concerns there. Really, obviously, then just comes down to what the Warriors would have to give up in a trade in terms of, I'm certainly, like, I've seen proposed deals that include Kuminga for Butler. I'm not in any way, shape or form putting Jonathan Kuminga in a deal for Jimmy Butler. I'm just not automatically, like, Pods is not in there. So really, you could have your pick of players outside of Steph, Draymond, Pods, Kuminga. Like, there'd be automatically the 4 off the table for Jimmy Butler. And then in terms of pick-wise, again, given the contractual stuff, given that he could technically be on an expiring, like, you're not going to want to give up too much for a guy who could become a free agent and technically walk out the door if you don't give him an extension in the summer of 2025. I don't know, a couple of first round picks max. I don't know. It's hard to evaluate where the trade value of Jimmy Butler is right now. And, yes, the Warriors could give him an extension and it's all fantastic, fine. But he has shown previously that he's more than willing to go to another team after just being in a team for half a season. Of course, he got traded from Minnesota to Philly and then packed up from Philly when they seemingly prioritised Tobias Harris instead, obviously, quite infamously, and then went to the Heat. He's now been there for 5 seasons. He's like proven playoff performer. We know playoff Jimmy. He's taken the Heat to the finals 2 of the last 4 years. So it's really, he'd be fantastic second star next to Steph. Just the contractual concerns, the shooting concerns, slight injury concerns, just makes it, it's not perfect. And therefore, as a result, I wouldn't want to give up too much in a trade. And I'd also just I'd have other options that I'd prefer. Like, ultimately, I'd prefer things to hit the fan in Phoenix with KD or Devin Booker, or the Lakers with LeBron. I still think LeBron would be a better target than Jimmy. I think LeBron's just probably a better player than Jimmy still at this stage, even despite being 39 years old. So I think Jimmy, he's obviously a star caliber player, and I think if you are a star, at this point, that's just what the Warriors need, particularly if you're an all-star forward. We've seen over the course of this calendar year so far, they've gone after LeBron, missed out, George missed out, Markkanen missed out. If you're a forward who's made an all-star team in the last few seasons, fair to say the Warriors are probably going to have interest in you. That's just what it is. But I think that Jimmy's probably not at the top on the priority list, albeit, yeah, they would have interest and see what it would take. I'd like to know more about what those phone calls may have entailed. Of course, that's probably not going to come out necessarily. But it's certainly Jimmy's someone to monitor given his contractual situation, given an off-season of a little bit of animosity between him and the Heat, and he's no stranger to moving teams, is he? Like, he's obviously started his career out in Chicago, Minnesota, Philly, Miami. He's been at 4 different teams now. So certainly someone to monitor from a Warrior perspective, but again, not someone that I would have at the absolute top. But at some point, do the Warriors just have to pull the trigger on a trade here and stop saying to themselves, oh, well, we think there's going to be a better trade package, a better trade candidate available to us down the track, so we're not going to do this thing right now. I mean, the longer you do that, the longer you're wasting Steph's prime, and that's obviously one of the big criticisms among fans at the moment. The other thing over the last 24, 48 hours was a report from Anthony Slater in regard to the contract extensions of Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody. Slater, quote here, said there hasn't been significant progress towards a deal in either case. Of course, we are 6 weeks out from the October 21 deadline where those two guys can sign extensions. Slater also said that the Warriors at this point are unwilling to offer the max 5-year, $224 million deal to Kuminga, which I completely, you guys know if you've listened to my podcast over this offseason, you know that I don't think the Warriors should be offering Kuminga the max at this stage. My max that I'd offer Kuminga is probably 5-year, 160. The interesting thing that I haven't spoken about when it comes to the Kuminga Moody extension that Slater noted in his article is the idea of the poison pill contract, which I was aware of, but of course I just hadn't mentioned it. But I do think it's very important because it does come into these negotiation talks a little bit when it comes to the contracts of JK and Moses. So for those of you that don't know, poison pill contract is essentially players entering their fourth seasons who get an extension after their third year. So JK and Moses in this situation, Jordan Poole a couple of years ago. Basically what happens is that once that extension has been agreed upon, then if you are to trade that player in their fourth year, then the outgoing salary for the team that has the player is only their fourth-year contract, but the incoming salary for the team that's taking that player, that's acquiring that player, is their fourth-year contract plus the average of their their 4 or 5 years on the extension. So to put it simply, if the Warriors, let's say the Warriors agree to a deal with JK that I've said 5 years, 160, right? He's on $7.6 million this season. That means that the outgoing salary for the Warriors in a trade is only $7.6 million. But for the team acquiring him, it's $167.6 million over 6 years, which is an average of about $28 million. So you've got the contrast there between the outgoing salary from the Warriors and the incoming salary from the other team. Essentially, you don't need to know anything else, but essentially it means a trade is almost impossible. It is literally like it's possible, but it's almost as if there's a no trade clause there. Like once that player signs that contract, it pretty much means they can't get traded until the following offseason, which is what we saw with Jordan Poole. So if the Warriors wanted to trade Jordan Poole before the mid-season deadline in his fourth season, that was another poison pill contract. They just couldn't have, especially with so many teams with no salary cap space. Essentially, it's impossible. It's not literally impossible, but it's pretty much impossible to make a trade. So that's what the Warriors have got to think here if they are dealing an extension to Kuminga or Moody. Is if you do that, you're basically, as the Warriors, conceding that we're not going to trade these guys for until next offseason at the earliest. Like you're taking them off the table from a trade standpoint before the February trade deadline. You're conceding that. Now, maybe it's a little bit different with Moses because Moses is you could maybe make a deal work there if he's only making, let's say, an average of $13 million over his extension. So if he's going from 5, 6 to $13 million, then it's obviously the contrast there is not as much, and therefore maybe you could deal him. But with Kuminga, if you're going from $7.6 million that he's making his fourth year, and you've given him a $160 million extension over 5 years, it's just difficult. It's too difficult to make a trade. So it's just definitely with Kuminga, it would be taking him off the table, which is what you ideally do anyway. You're not going to sign a guy to a $160 million contract and turn around and trade him within literally within months. So it still does remove the flexibility, though, from a Warriors standpoint, because if you, as I said before, in terms of talking about the Jimmy stuff, what happens if Kevin Durant, LeBron James become available before the mid-season trade deadline, like these real top-end superstar players? If you don't have Kuminga and Moody as trade assets in that scenario, that could be the difference between you getting that player or not, right? And therefore, that could be the difference between whether you're in championship contention or not, because I think most of us would say, well, if you just put LeBron on the Warriors tomorrow or you put KD on the Warriors tomorrow, Warriors are probably a contender in the West, right? They're probably a top 4 or 5 team and therefore have a legitimate shot at making a deep playoff run. So that's, I think, a really important element in all of this is that are the Warriors willing to risk their trade flexibility by giving extensions to Kuminga and Moody. Because if they do, again, they're pretty much conceding that they're not going to be trade eligible until next offseason, which is obviously what we saw with Jordan Poole. The Warriors didn't trade. There wasn't really any talk about the Warriors trading Poole anyway ahead of the deadline. It was not until the offseason, particularly after his playoffs in that series against the Lakers in the second round, it was like, well, this is not necessarily looking like a great contract necessarily. And I think the Warriors had a very firm view on that and ended up dealing him for Chris Paul. So it's going to be interesting to see if either side moves. I did speak about it on last episode as well, where if we get to the last 24, 48 hours and JK's got $160 million or $150 million, whatever it is, sitting there on the table, is he really going to turn that down? Is he really going to risk that for trying to get an extra $60 million when anything could happen, touch wood, but hopefully he doesn't get injured or anything. But that's a risky move to make, and that's why I still have some hope that maybe there's still a deal to be made there in the last 24, 48 hours where one of the sides, and particularly if it's JK's side, and if they're pretty steadfast on getting the max right now, then again, I just don't think the Warriors are going to give it to him. And I don't know why that would change from the Warriors' standpoint. I don't know why the Warriors would change from we're not giving you a max now to we're going to give you the max 24 hours before the deadline. I don't think that will happen. I think if a deal has to be made, it's JK and his camp thinking, yeah, you know what, if there's $150, $160 million on the table, we're not going to give that up. That's obviously life-altering money. We're going to take that. And so that's why I still have some hope. And the Moody thing, who knows? It's widely reported $11 to $13 million per season. I might be willing to risk that if I was him and try and play yourself into some more, because there's obviously less that you're giving up. It's not the $160 million that JK would be giving up. It's going to be fascinating. But the Warriors outside of that don't have too much orders of business before training camp starts here in a few weeks. We'll finish it up there. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the podcast, or if you've been watching on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed already, that'd be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. And other than that, guys, have a great weekend.